About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's go, let's be free with me. Be free. Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free. Let's go, let's be
Improved by a whole grade. I've improved. Improved.
By a whole grade.
By a whole grade.
By a whole grade.
My teacher isn't just Mr. Maddock. It's a whole teaching team made up of James, Mike and Marta.
My classroom's all about doing and applying. My days standing at the front of the classroom with a PowerPoint are long gone.
I master every concept by learning at my own pace.
I spend 100% of my class time interacting and supporting individual students.
I move on only when the moment is right for me, not the whole class.
I know what each and every student is mastering and struggling on at every moment.
I know exactly what I need to learn next, and I can go back and review material at any time.
I spend my teaching time supporting and inspiring, not planning, delivering and marking.
I can learn from anywhere at any time.
I can switch off when school closes, knowing they are learning from the best.
My teacher has my homework marked before I get to class.
I set every piece of homework at the start of the year.
I'm 2 weeks ahead of my expected progress.
I can track everyone's progress with a swipe of a finger.
I can track my own progress and set my own targets.
I now have time to focus on developing the skills of every learner in my classroom.
I know exactly what it means to explain, evaluate and analyse, and I'm not afraid of any exam.
My lessons are now far more about the skills and the application, not just the content itself.
I've completely remodeled what it means to be a teacher in my classroom.
Good afternoon, one and all. James here at the EverLearner. Well, at the EverLearner, I mean in Farnborough in Hampshire, actually. But it's Thursday, 26th of April 2018. I forgot what month and year it was there for a second. And we are live, so it's great to see you here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, teachers, those of you that have our shows take place in your classroom. It's genuinely appreciated having that live audience. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Reminders, I know you hear from me all the time. Subscribe. We have made our first milestone of over 1,000 subscribers. We anticipate that before the exams finish, we will be between 5,000 and 10,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel. And let me tell you, that's going to make a big difference because we're going to be able to use this YouTube channel for a whole host of other things. So do please subscribe if you have not done so already. Secondly, you need your notes pages with you for this session. It's quite a drawy, sketchy, kind of annotated kind of session. So you need those notes pages with those really nice images on them, and you need to be making your notes over the top of that as well as preparing to answer those questions. About the questions, don't forget that, let's say I'm delivering stuff to you today, I don't know, for argument's sake, for 40 or 45 minutes. That gives you guys 15 minutes where you can be answering questions in that gap. And again, of course, you can do them when you get home tonight or whatever else, or whatever other time you want to. Now, in terms of interacting with the show today, you have got two main options. First of all is you can go, and I think Marta's going to show that for us now, you can go and have a go at our interactive questions. Go to theeverlearner.com, hit news, and from news, please then hit the post, which is the interactive questions, and find this session, which I can't remember if it's session 5 or 6 now, but it's the one on recovery, Marta. Session 5? Session 6. There you go. We're 6 sessions of A-level in. We're making good progress. And you can go on there and you can complete some questions about recovery, okay? So go and have a look at that. I'm going to do some demos of those answers as well in the actual teaching element of this today, but you can submit your answers to us, and what we're about to do, we're very close to doing this, we can then start recirculating really nice answers out to the community, and you guys can benefit from those. So by contributing them, that's really good. The other thing is, during the little breaks between the teaching episodes, we'd like you to contact us at hashtag revision break. Is it like that? Okay, that one. Hashtag revision break. So send us your photos and show us what you're doing. We will always put relevant photos into the stream. If you want to shout it, if it's your birthday, if you want to call out, get us on hashtag revision break on Facebook, Instagram, or on Twitter, and we will feature you in this show. If you are taking photos of someone else, make sure you've got their permission before you do that. The session today is about recovery. We're going to look at the big picture first, and then we're going to drill down into the details of the different components of EPOC and the fate of lactic acid. This is a feature of the course that pretty much everybody does if they're doing a level 3 physiology course. The only exception is the BTEC Level 3 Sport Unit 1 on the examined version, although the exam board still managed to put it on the exam paper last year despite it not actually being on the course, which was an interesting moment.
Classic.
Yeah, it's a classic. You know, we haven't named it in the spec, but we'll ask a big old question on it anyway. But for everyone else, this is completely relevant for you. So we're going to get into that. Marta, have I missed anything before we get started?
I'm not sure if you mentioned the notes. Make sure they've got the notes ready.
I mentioned that. You weren't listening.
Okay, sorry. I was busy with controlling the whole thing, so sorry about that.
Well, I have forgotten to introduce Marta. Marta, welcome to the show. This is our second show of the day. This is second of 3 live broadcasts that I'm doing today. I'm doing another one tonight on a podcast called Leave Your Mark. This evening I did a podcast last night called Do It Dad. This is another one I'm doing tonight, so that's going to be interesting with a guy who's he's a therapist to professional National Hockey League players in the US and Canada. It's going to be kind of interesting, I think. So that's what's happening. But all that being said, I think we are ready to go. We've got a ton of information to cover today, so let's get Oh, I should have said microphone change. Don't forget, I'm changing to this microphone here, so you may need to adjust your volume. Otherwise, I think we're ready to go. So here we go, a bit of recovery. Now, let me be super clear here. In session 1, we're going to talk about sort of the general structure of recovery, and in sort of the second session today, especially for you guys who are taking live, if you're on demand, obviously you can skip backwards and forwards, but for you guys that are on the live stream today, what we're going to do is we're going to get into real specifics of EPOC. Okay, so just be aware that in this first session, I'm going to try and give you the big picture before really drilling down in that second part. So if you wonder in the first section, why isn't he telling us all the details about the fast component or the lactic acid component or whatever, that's why, because we're going to kind of cover that in the second part. So all that being said, let's start to figure out and make sure we understand what recovery
is. Now, we are going to touch in a moment on recovery during exercise, but at least to begin with, we're going to consider or assume that the recovery we're referring to is a post-exercise state. And of course, that's going to lead us to that concept of epoch. However, don't be shocked to find out in a few minutes' time that that epochs can occur during exercise when activity is kind of more intermittent, like a gameplay where you have a quiet moment. Of course, to recover in that moment, it's not the end of the match, but it's a quiet time when we recover in that period. So just be aware of that big picture. Okay, so this oxygen consumption curve here, I don't think it's going to shock anybody or surprise anybody. Note to this word up here, this is a sub-maximal performance. So if you like, consider this to be something like a 20-minute training run, or equivalent. You know, the simplest piece of continuous training that we might be able to analyze. You make it a swim, make it a cycle, make it whatever you want. But let's make sure that we're understanding that that's what we've got here, sub-maximal, non-maximal performance. So we have on our axes time. Time is passing over there, and we, as I just said, from here to here, we might assume it's something like 20 minutes. Okay, something like that. Make it 30, doesn't matter. This is just illustrative. That was hard to say. It's just illustrative. Illustrative. You know what I mean. It's just illustrating this situation. We have, first of all, here we have our resting level, not of heart rate, notice, because on the y-axis we have oxygen consumption. Now you might say, James, that looks like a heart rate graph, heart rate response to exercise graph. Yes, it does. It's the same shape. Oxygen consumption happens in the same way. We also get our anticipatory rise in the same way. Don't forget that this is a release of adrenaline, which acts to both increase the rate and strength of heart contractions, but also of our breathing depth. Okay, so as a result of that, so that adrenaline acting on the SA node, for example, we effectively start delivering more oxygen into the body and consuming more oxygen. So we get that anticipatory rise again. But of course here, let me just go for some kind of stronger colour here, we get the start of exercise. Now, of course, in a perfect biological system, what we would find is that our oxygen consumption would go straight up and would go like that. Okay? But of course, we are not a perfect biological system. We have to respond and gradually increase our oxygen consumption. So as a result, we actually build up a deficit. Okay, and this is the deficit we're talking about, this one here. It is an oxygen deficit. It is an oxygen deficit. And let me make sure we understand what we mean by an oxygen deficit. Okay, we are talking about a quantity of oxygen that would have been used, if it were available. Okay, so we're saying therefore that in this period here and this quantity here, because remember, anything above the graph, indeed anything below the graph, is oxygen that was consumed. Anything above the graph is oxygen that wasn't consumed. But we know that this is the required rate for the steady state exercise. So we're saying here that there was a batch of oxygen that we couldn't get to the working muscle and consume in this period that we would have used if it were available. So it therefore leads to a question: how then was that energy produced? And of course, the energy was produced anaerobically. Okay, it was done anaerobically. So we had to fulfill certain anaerobic processes for that energy to be produced. So think about your lactic acid system. To a lesser extent, think about your ATP-PC system. This is how that work was done. For the remainder of the exercise, we have a steady state relationship. Steady state means that O2 demand, she got this the wrong way around, equals O2 supply. You can put that the other way around. It doesn't really matter because it's equal on both sides. But so here we are getting the right amount of oxygen into our muscle that is required by the muscle to generate enough energy in that moment. Okay, even though we've still got this deficit over here. Okay, even though we've still got this deficit over here. And what we find, of course, is that at the end of exercise, there's our kind of end of exercise line. What you might expect in a perfect system is that our oxygen consumption drops and goes like that. But of course, we don't have a perfect system. And rather than that, we have to recover and repay the oxygen deficit by this process of epoch. So let's get it crystal clear. What I'm now shading in as yellow, let me choose a different color. What we're now shading in as green is a quantity of oxygen that was consumed post-exercise over and above resting levels that is repaying this oxygen deficit over here. So a couple of things on epoch. First of all, on epoch, let's make sure that we know that epoch is excess post-exercise, one word folks, post-exercise oxygen consumption. Now in many ways that says what epoch is, but I want to give a crystal clear definition. So let me just I should have space here. So this is my definition. Quantity. Oh, you can put an article in there, say a quantity of oxygen consumed post-exercise, as we've just seen, over and above that which would have been consumed at rest. So let's just make sure we get conceptually this idea. We're saying that obviously this here is our resting level. That is our resting level, okay? You see here, whatever that oxygen consumption is there, that is our resting level. And basically what we're saying is that this oxygen consumption did happen post-exercise, and look, it is above the resting level. It is above the resting level. So it's a quantity of oxygen consumed post-exercise over and above that which would have been consumed at rest. So this is heartbeats, this is respiratory muscle contractions, this is smooth muscles which are still directing oxygenated blood to now the worked muscle, what was the working muscle, and it's repaying this oxygen deficit. So that for me is a really, really, really important big picture. Now, despite the fact that I've made this a terribly ugly graph, let me just remind myself what are the images we have here. Oh, let's go to here. So for me, the really important thing here is that we can also, by the way, this is exactly the same curve, look. This is the O2 deficit. Then we have epoch post-exercise. The only difference is here is that we could consider this to be like almost like a maximal performance curve. You know, it peaks and then we fatigue. But the point we're making, if I just go back up to the original, we basically separate epoch into two periods. What I've now got is the blue period and the green period. Now, they're not literally separate. They merge and overlap one another. You guys know this because it's common sense. But what we can say here is the features of the two components of epoch are really, really different. So if we look at this first component, we're going to call it the fast or the A-lactic acid component in a moment. That first component, which is the kind of this reddy colour, it's what we would call a steep decline. Steep decline. Okay, I'm going to talk about the details of it in a few moments' time. Okay, it's a steep decline. Whereas if we take this slow or lactic acid component, this is what we might call, I don't know how well you guys can, let me write this on the black. This is what we would call a leveling off. Okay, you see how the fall gets much more gradual here. It's much more gradual where it's very steep here. We've kind of exaggerated it a little bit, but you get the idea. We get an actual fall. And the other thing is, in terms of oxygen consumption, you can now get specific detail that we're talking about a volume of oxygen in litres per minute. Okay, in litres per minute. So we could literally measure this quantity, more of which in a second. We could also literally measure this quantity, more of which in a second. So let's think about Josh for a moment. His performance, first of all, his performance is anaerobic. We all know that is, I don't know what I've written, anaerobic. His performance is anaerobic, okay? So as a result of that, he builds up an oxygen deficit, okay? In his race, let's take the 100 meters, he does not breathe, probably. Okay, he may well hold his breath for his race, so he does not breathe. Now, if you think about that for a second, if he's not breathing, by definition, that is not aerobic work. So what does that mean for him? It means that post-exercise, I'm rushing here, folks, forgive me. Post-exercise, he must recover. And the point I'd like to make to you is that that recovery is aerobic. Okay? So what we're seeing here in this curve is that the epoch period post-exercise is a period of time when the aerobic system is in operation. Now, for those that took the session I did yesterday live on the energy systems, you'll know I referred to this. I referred to that aerobic system, that mad system of glycogen breaking all the way down into Krebs, etc., forming 1 to 38 ATP. That isn't just for when we do a triathlon. That isn't just for when we run a marathon. That isn't just for 10-kilometer runners. It's also the recovery system. So get it clear in your mind that this epoch is an application and presentation of the aerobic energy system, which is going through numerous processes to allow us to recover aerobically. I got a little bit heated there. Forgive me, folks. Sometimes I get a bit carried away. Now, that is the big picture. The only other thing I wanted to say at this point is, and shall I tell you it or shall I ask for feedback? And no, let me sort of pose it. So if you look at this area here, and this kind of looks like I've had some kind of spray paint accident. Okay, if you look at this area here, you might notice it's quite similar to this area here. Okay, it's quite similar. It looks kind of the same. One's above the curve, oxygen that wasn't consumed. One's below the curve, oxygen that was consumed. And you might be able to think to yourself, well, O2 deficit equals epoch. And you could have a comfy sort of feeling of, oh yeah, that makes sense. That seems about right. We build up a deficit and then we basically repay it afterwards. And everyone would be like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. But what else do you notice about the size of these areas? Can you see that the epoch one is probably 15-20% larger? And that is because this relationship is not true. O2 equals epoch. But epoch has some other stuff on its side. So on this side, we have to have, or I didn't mean to put it into equation actually, O2 deficit, we can consider to be equal to epoch. However, here, of course, we've got a load of heartbeats, muscular contractions, respiratory muscle, diaphragm contractions that did not happen. Here, we've got a load of heartbeats, diaphragm contractions, respiratory muscle contractions, smooth muscle contractions that did happen to power this period. So within this area, it's slightly bigger in the epoch area because it also includes all of the oxygen which powers that heart contraction, which powers that diaphragm contraction, which powers that smooth muscle constriction and dilation, for example. So this, by definition, this multicolored madness has to be slightly bigger than the oxygen deficit. Okay, I'm not going to labor that point anymore because it's ultimately not super important. Let's have a look at some questions. Look closely at this graph of oxygen consumption. It should feel familiar. Explain why. I've seen that term. I know now. I'm going to be saying because. I'm going to be saying therefore, comma. I'm going to be saying things like this means. I'm going to be saying things like this causes. And I might even say things like through and by, although we tend to use those more for explain how, but nevertheless. So these are the words that I really, as soon as I see and explain why, I know I'm including them in my answer because that's what explaining language is. I mean, that's not an extensive list, not an exhaustive list, but that's what explaining why is. So let's have a little look at this, please. So let's get started. So explain why the green area is present. So why is that there at all? Okay, so let's go through. This is because an oxygen deficit has been created, okay? And, you know, if we were asked for it, we could actually draw that in, couldn't we? There's my oxygen deficit there. Okay, an oxygen deficit has been created. And air, so we're going to get, obviously, hopefully, we should get a mark for saying because there was an oxygen deficit. We're looking for 4. And area A represents epoch. So I've named epoch. Now, I have to say, I was just looking at my answer a moment ago. I'm a bit disappointed because I really do think that I probably should have defined epoch at this point and said what epoch is because it's all about that. So the only thing I'd say to you is if you look at what the next question is, if this was part of the same exam paper, then we might not get definition mark twice, right? So epoch is the repaying of the oxygen deficit. We might get a mark for saying repaying oxygen deficit, possibly. Okay, possibly. Let's move to the next part of our answer. The anaerobic processes, so I'm saying it's anaerobic in the oxygen deficit, have produced lactic acid, broken down CP, and utilized stores of ATP. So that's what's happened here. That's what's happened here. And these are restored and resynthesized post-exercise in the process of EPOC. And there, hopefully, is my max. Okay. Now, would I get some extra credit for saying produce lactic acid, broken down CP, utilize stored ATP? Possibly, but I'm ultimately being asked about this. So it's about resynthesizing those things. Okay, so there's one little answer for us. Notice things like because that I've used it in there. So we've got the through that's in there, for example. And I'm not going to go through the whole answer again, but we clearly have explaining language. Now, on the define answer, let's have a look. Define epoch. Define is what we want there is to give the meaning of something. So if I'm asked to define epoch, I'm going to get nothing for describing it, for explaining it. I'm going to have to give the meaning, the literal definition. So let's put that in. We've already done that. Epoch is a quantity of oxygen consumed post-exercise over and above that which would have been consumed at rest. Now, there's 2 marks available, so we'd probably get something like consumed post-exercise. Didn't mean to do this in orange, actually. It should have been red. That which over and above that which would have been consumed at rest. So I get my 2 marks, and I move on. Explain why again. So because, therefore, comma, this means, and so on and so on. Let's have a go at it. This is because, so explain why epoch occurs at the end of exercise. This is because the O2 deficit has been built up at the start of exercise, through anaerobic processes, and repaid after exercise through aerobic processes. And I get my max. Now that is some fairly straightforward, simple information, all of which we have detailed in this process. So if we can understand this, we can have a darn good effort at getting to know recovery pretty well. Okay, so I'm sure there'll be some questions on that, but nevertheless, let's get ourselves ready to move on to epoch. We'll be going back to the studio ever so shortly.
And welcome back, one and all. We live, Marta? Yeah, we're back up. Good. A couple of things. First of all, we had a report from somebody that there was like a quarter second out in the audio or something. So we're just monitoring that. We don't know. We haven't heard it, so we don't know if that is the case or not. But if you have, hopefully it hasn't been too impacting. Quarter second hopefully hasn't had too much impact. But the other thing, this is probably going to bore you senseless, but we have the prospect of our best ever dropped frame rate. Marta, what are we on? I want to stay in double figures today if we can. What are we on right now?
We're on 25.
We're on 25. So for anyone who's interested in like the tech side of this, that means that this obviously, as this image of me is streamed to you, it's constantly taking sort of framed still images and sending those out as like a video stream up to YouTube. So over the course of an hour, we send about 2 million frames, something like that. And our best ever score is dropping 101 frames in an hour's show. And right now we're on 20 something. That's really exciting. I know that bores you lot senseless, but it's the kind of stuff that gets me up in the morning, which obviously makes me an odd man, but that is who I am. Any questions, Marta?
Yes, we've got a couple of questions. Couple of questions coming in. Someone's asking, during an exam, would you get marks for annotating a graph if you were running out of time?
Interesting question. I'm going to be cautious to answer that with a firm answer. So I'm assuming that what you mean, sir or madam, is that you mean that the graph has been provided in the question and you're just annotating it. I would say in that case, probably not. If you draw the graph in your answer and annotate it, then you're much more likely to get marks. And I would go further than that. If the answer to the question, if you're being asked to describe the fast and slow component of epoch, I think it's perfectly legitimate to make a drawing in the answer. You probably don't want to do that alone, but it's perfectly legitimate and should be credited. But if the graph's already been provided in the question structure and you just add some words on that, I would say that that's not in the answer area, and therefore I think you'd have to, they might give you some credit, but I think you'd have to anticipate at this point that you wouldn't get any credit for that. I don't know if there's hard and set rules for that, but I think it's probably the best advice I can give you is to include drawings in your answers, perfectly legitimate, and I even encourage it. But if you're running out of time, then of course you want to get your knowledge down on that paper in as much detail, quantity and relevance as possible. So drawing may well help you, but you want to put that into the answer structure as long as it's relevant. It's not relevant, it doesn't matter, you're not going to get any marks. But if it's relevant, by all means draw. I think it's a good idea. And there have been many occasions in the past where I've seen students who get credit for even sketching out an answer linguistically, especially if they've got a big essay-based answer left, to put their plan in, to scroll down some keywords and some key concepts. Is it going to get you your max marks? No, but it might get you some credit where you may have got none if you're about to run out of time. So hopefully you wouldn't be in that situation, but if you have to, needs must.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And there's also one question coming in from, I think this one is related to yesterday's show. It is right from YouTube, but it might be, I don't know if it might be relevant to today.
We like YouTube comments. Keep them coming in.
So someone's asking, how can energy be high in intensity? Is energy not just energy? Well, the intensity is dependent on the amount released.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, basically. It's probably just a colloquialism, and how we describe things, we probably don't use the most scientific description of this sort of notion. So the way I would summarize that is that the intensity of energy is ultimately the quantity of energy which is being produced, which of course is directly related to force output. And force output is directly related to concepts of strength, of speed, of power. So therefore, yes, of course, our fast glycolytic fibers in combination with the phosphocreatine system produce high intensity energy. Why? Because they produce a lot of energy in a short period of time, whereas the aerobic system produces a moderate amount of energy over a long period of time. So the intensity relates to how much energy we release and utilize in the period of time, and the shorter it is, then the higher intensity we would describe that. But the point is completely legitimate.
Good. And then finally, can you please explain again why epoch is bigger than O2 deficit?
Okay, yeah. So this is something that I've always found confusing. My students have always found confusing. So because EPOC is repaying oxygen deficit, it is a natural assumption that they will be sort of identical in quantity and size. The difference should only come, right, because one is above the curve and didn't, and was oxygen consumption that didn't happen, and the other EPOC is below the curve and is oxygen consumption post-exercise that did happen. However, you have to realize that if it did happen, if oxygen consumption did happen, that has to be powered during EPOC. Okay, so it has to be powered by additional heart contractions and stronger, by respiratory muscles, by smooth muscles pulsing and maintaining venous return back to the heart. And all of those things require oxygen. So because those things are elevated in EPOC compared to during the oxygen deficit phase, those also require energy, and therefore we have to have a bigger EPOC phasing or bigger EPOC size than we would have of O2 deficit. But let me also be clear on something. This is a marginal point. Don't spend hours worrying about revising that. For me, it was a bit of a throwaway thing. Oh, wouldn't you like to know why kind of thing. I don't think it's going to be a 4 or 5 mark question in your exam. I'd be surprised if it gets you any marks in your exam. It was just something that I thought it was useful. And sometimes when you discuss these things, it gets you to the nub of the concept that we're trying to learn. So in this case, why is EPOC slightly bigger than O2 deficit? By exploring that idea, you get to know each concept better, which is why I brought it up to you. So I certainly wouldn't be thinking you're going to get a 6-mark evaluation question on something like that. It's not going to happen. It was just me on a tangent. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So I don't know what time it is. So I'm in your hands, really. I reckon we've got a good 18, 19, 20-minute chunk to do. So I would suggest we probably make progress. So if you guys are ready, I'm ready.
Okay, so EPOC, remind yourself, it is the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Remind yourselves. I wrote it down up here somewhere, didn't I? The excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Make sure you know that, all right? You need to know that. You need to know that P is post-exercise, for example. It literally tells us what it means. Excess, the additional post-exercise, after exercise, oxygen consumption, amount of oxygen that we consume, the quantity of oxygen consumed post-exercise over and above that which would have been consumed at rest. It is an exact, specific definition of the concept. Okay, so you must be able to undertake that skill and describe those things, define those things. So what we want to do now is we want to look at the specifics of the fast and slow component. So let me choose my colors correctly. So here we are going to talk about the fast component. It's the kind of the pinky salmony bit on the graph. We also want to call this the alactacid component. Some of you need to use that term. Some of you don't, by the way, but just know it's exactly the same idea. Alactacid component of EPOC. Okay. Now, just something on alactacid. A, as the prefix, means the non or the opposite. The non-lactacid component. That should make a lot of sense to us. The non-lactacid component. The non-lactacid, the fast component. Okay, so what happens within this process? Okay, what happens within this process? And there's a couple of things I want to draw out with you here. First of all, we get what we would refer to, when I say first of all, it doesn't necessarily happen first, but we get resaturation of myoglobin with O2. Okay, and this forms oxymyoglobin, and you might want to remind yourself that oxymyoglobin or myoglobin is the product within the muscle which is a store and transporter of oxygen to the mitochondria. Okay, so of course during our work we effectively deplete myoglobin of its oxygen coupling, and here we recouple or we resaturate. It's a really nice term for you to use, please. We resaturate myoglobin with oxygen. Now we have other processes happening in this fast component. We also have the resynthesis of phosphocreatine. Now you may want to quickly reflect that probably the last time you would have studied the ATP-PC system, there was a creatine and a phosphagen knocking about uncoupled within the muscle, within the sarcoplasm. And of course within this fast component, within this alactacid component of EPOC, we resynthesize that phosphagen and creatine back together, and that becomes our kind of 10-second store of explosive energy within the sarcoplasm of the muscle cell. And finally, we also get resynthesis of ATP. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about the 2 to 3 second store that exists in all muscles. So we go through these processes, and these processes are the things, that's not going to work, these processes are the processes that are happening within that period I've just kind of outlined really. Okay, now that's not to say that it's only that. That's not to say there's no overlap with the slow component. Of course, it's not like our biological systems kind of literally go, I've done that first thing, now I'm switching, I'm flicking the switch. No, they overlap and they converge. But the predominant processes in the fast component are these ones. So try and get your head around that. And of course, you've got 3 specific pieces of terminology and jargon there that, let me tell you, you are going to use in your exam responses. So do it. Okay, get that language learned. Now, a couple of other little details. Let me just change colours. Still talking about the fast component, the alactic component. Things that I like you to know about this is that 50% PC resynthesis, 50% PC resynthesis takes 30 seconds. Okay, so if we take this point here, resynthesis of phosphocreatine, we're saying that 50% of total resynthesis of our total store takes 30 seconds. Now, that's just kind of a giveaway piece of information. But if we start applying that to weight training, interval training, for example, all of a sudden, or HIIT training, for example, we start to get to an interesting perspective. We get 50% reproduction of our phosphocreatine stores in 30 seconds of recovery. Can we use that in a training and performance application? Can we use that if we are a tennis player and we make sure we get 30 seconds, for example, between points? This is kind of information. We might not realize it, but this comes out naturally in players' performances or in sports people's performances in different genres. The other point we can make here is that 100% of PC resynthesis, 100% takes, and it depends what textbook you read here, but I'm going to give you the figure of 2 to 3 minutes. Now, traditionally, I would have always said 3 minutes, but I've seen more recently that you can get credit for saying 2 minutes. So I'm just saying something between 2 to 3 minutes. If you want to check your specification for the exact number that they expect, but those numbers are going to get you your mark. And finally, this whole process takes between 1 to 4 liters, 1 to 4 liters of O2. So this entire area, as a combination, would be between 1 to 4 liters, 1 to 4 liters of oxygen. 1 to 4 liters of oxygen total is what that takes. Now, we of course, now want to look at the slow component. Okay, so let's look at the slow component, or what we call, not surprisingly, the lactacid component. The lactacid component of EPOC. Okay. In this case, we've got lactacid, literally means the lactic acid component. Notice we haven't got the A, the non-lactic acid, we've got lactacid component. So what's happening here? Well, it's kind of simpler here. So we're saying basically that we get the removal of lactic acid, more of which in a second. The removal of lactic acid. So this area here is all about the removal of lactic acid. And what we're saying basically is that process, let me do my dot in line. That process there, it can take approximately 5 minutes, but it can be up to 1 hour. And this is, of course, up to 1 hour to remove that lactic acid if we've worked particularly hard anaerobically. So if you start to think about that, it makes really important and it makes really intuitive sense that we do an active cool down. Why? Because we can remove lactic acid faster if we maintain our venous return, if we maintain our distribution of cardiac output to the worked muscle. So an active cool down can reduce this period of time. And finally, this whole process of the lactic component takes between 5 to 8 liters of oxygen. So this area here, choose a decent colour to do this. This area here, I don't know how well we've depicted it in our image, but I guess it would kind of carry on a bit. This area here is significantly larger than the red area, the fast component, because it takes between 5 and 8 litres of oxygen to undertake those processes. So that is sort of the crucial information about those two components. Now what I want to do is I want to think, right, let's take Laura. Laura's a really good gymnast. I want to ask the question of where does the lactic acid go in that slow component? Where does lactic acid go? Where does it end up? What do we do with it? And there's a couple of principles before I get into kind of this illustration. There's a couple of principles I'd like you to kind of, those of you that study biochemistry, so do I, but I'm not going down that route today. So when we talk in a moment about buffering, when we talk in a moment about gluconeogenesis, I'm going to be naming those things. So do forgive me for that. I've got numerous videos like on lactic acid buffering. I've got one of my favorite videos I've ever made is on that topic. If you go and have a look at the website, go onto the EverLearner.com, and if it's on your course, it's there waiting for you. Okay. But the key point I want to make to you guys is if we think about the production of lactic acid, right, this is in the sort of the exercise moment. Lactic acid does not stay in its lactic acid form for any period of time. It breaks down into two things. It breaks down into lactate, okay, and it breaks down into hydrogen. It breaks down into hydrogen ion. And it's this hydrogen ion which is effectively the fatiguing, poisonous bit. All right, and we remove that stuff, including during exercise, in the presence of what we call the bicarbonate ion that is produced in the kidney. And basically what happens is that we produce this bicarbonate, literally that sort of alkaline stuff that we can put in our cakes. We produce this bicarbonate ion, that meant to be ion there, not IO, bicarbonate ion, we produce it in the kidneys, and the bicarbonate ion moves through the blood and it picks up these hydrogen ions and it converts it into CO2 and water, and we breathe it out, so we get rid of it in that way. Just be aware that there's a stage in between where we form a product called carbonic acid, which sounds like vicious, nasty stuff, doesn't it? But when bicarbonate combines with hydrogen ion, it forms carbonic acid, and carbonic acid immediately breaks down into CO2 and water, which we then breathe out at the lung. Okay, so basically we breathe the nasty bit out. So the question therefore remains is, what do we do with this stuff? And I want you to know that the lactate bit is the energy rich part. It's energy rich. Okay, so what happens to that? Well, here's where our illustration now comes in handy. So a small amount of that lactate, remember just the lactate, not the lactic acid total, that small amount of that lactate, we literally convert it to protein, and that protein is called urea. And when we form urea, we have two options with that. It can either leave our bodies in the form of sweat, or it can leave our bodies in the form of pee. Okay, urination. All right, so we either sweat it out or we pee it out. We can get rid of lactate in that way. But that, in many ways, feels wasteful. Okay, because, as we said, this is an energy-rich product. So we've also said, as I said a moment ago, this is more specifically this part, we get rid of it in the form. Oh, sorry. Let me rephrase that. We've actually got an error on our image here. Okay, so this, I'd like you to cross that out. This is actually a different system. Okay, so I've already told you about that bicarbonate ion. So what we should have here is H2O and CO2 in this sense with lactate works in a different way. So you might remember previously that pyruvic acid becomes lactic acid, and it doesn't become things like acetyl-CoA, for example. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, go and have a look at our session from yesterday. It doesn't become acetyl-CoA. It doesn't use citric acid. It doesn't go into the Krebs cycle. But what we're saying with lactate, we can take our lactate and we can effectively reverse this. And now that lactate can become acetyl-CoA. It can become citric acid. It can move through the Krebs cycle. It can move through the electron transport chain. And what do we produce at the end of that? Other than energy, we produce H2O and CO2, so water and carbon dioxide. So we produce those things because we take our lactate and basically we use it aerobically. Now the other thing we can do is we can take our lactate and make it into glucose. How do we do that? We take our lactate, we convert it back to pyruvic acid, and then we convert it back to glucose. And that is called gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis. And with glycogen, the way that works is we just keep going up the chain and we reconvert it as glycogen and we store it in the muscle and in the liver, and we call that glyconeogenesis. Glyconeogenesis. So that's what we do with lactic acid. Sorry about that confusion there. That shouldn't have been on there. That's my mistake. Okay, so let's have a little look at some questions now that we know what happens to lactic acid. So here we go. Excuse me. Laura's floor routines last for approximately 90 seconds. That sounds about right. And we know that's kind of going to produce that oxygen deficit. It's kind of anaerobic in that point. Describe how Laura is able to remove lactic acid during and after her performance. Now, first of all, we've put this question in this way deliberately. And my point to you would be, what is wrong with that question? There is something fundamentally flawed about that question. Do you guys spot it? You teachers out there, do you spot what the flaw in this question is? I'm just going to hold fire just for 5 seconds. Have a look at it again. It is a completely flawed question. We wrote it, by the way, but it's flawed. Not to say you wouldn't get the question, but it's flawed. Does anybody know why? The answer to that is this command, describe how. Okay? If we think about describing, we are giving the characteristics. We are giving the composition. But what this question is actually asking us is not that describing stuff. It's asking us to effectively explain how. And you're going to see this. I would be confident you'll see a wording like this in your exam. Describe how. What they actually mean is explain how. And we know that when we explain how, we're using words such as through, by, we might use because, we might use this means. This is the language that we're going to use, as opposed to describing, which is this is characterized by, this is composed of, this is like the following. So we're going to explain how. So I know that's going to frustrate people, but we kind of want to prep you. If you get this describe how, it's really asking you explain how. Anyway, so explain how Laura is able to remove lactic acid during and after her performance. During and after her performance. So again, we must answer both parts of this. So it's a bit of an analysis as well. Here's my answer. Oof, what a lot of writing. Let me get my red pen. During performance, I'm addressing that first bit, Laura can remove lactic acid through the buffering system. This means, look, there's my language. This means the bicarbonate ion. Okay, let's say, how many marks have I got for this question? Okay, I got 6 marks. Let's say there's 3 marks, 3 submax for during and 3 submax for after. This bicarbonate ion produced in the kidney mops up hydrogen ion. So there's my mark. We're now perhaps going to get a submax because I've done 3 marks out of the 6 from during exercise and converts to carbonic acid before being breathed out after breathed out. So there's my submax there. After exercise, I'm addressing the other point. The lactacid component of EPOC removes lactic acid by converting it to protein and by converting it to both glucose. Now I've got my max, and of course glycogen could potentially get us a mark if there weren't just 6 available. So I've clearly done the during, I've clearly done the after, I've clearly put enough content in there to get my marks, and I get my 6 marks as a result. And can I remind you what I said before? If you get a describe how question, I mean, first of all, I don't think you should, but if you do, what they mean is explain how. Use this language here, okay? Because if you used the characteristics, the composition, it's like, it's not like, you're not going to get to the skill that ultimately they're asking for. Sometimes we call this, it's often what we call a false friend. Okay, a false friend. It appears to be a describing question, but actually isn't. Now, if you want to ask a question why the exam board wouldn't just put explain how in there, ask it afterwards when cynicism might not be negative for you. For now, let's just go through the process. Okay, next part. Analyze epoch, making specific reference to a range of ways that epoch can be minimized. So now I've got an application of how can I minimize epoch. Remember, analyzing, what that means, it means to break something down, and explain it. Okay, so here, what am I going to break down? Analyze epoch. Well, I've got to break down epoch. Well, does epoch have more than one part to it? Oh, that's convenient. We've got at least 2 parts to epoch, so we can break it down in that way. Let's have a look at how we wrote it. Here we go. Firstly, classic analyze opening. Firstly, comma. Here's my first chunk. Firstly, to begin with, in commencement, just say firstly, comma. Firstly, comma. The alactacid component, here's something. I'm naming the alactacid component. The alactacid component lasts for up to 3 minutes. Notice up to 3 minutes. It lasts for up to 3 minutes and contributes by resaturating myoglobin, resynthesizing ATP. Okay, and now perhaps I've got a submax. Why? Because I'm not saying about minimizing this. Okay, so now, and by forming creatine phosphate, exactly what I said before. Now, secondly, the lactacid component involves the removal of lactic acid, but the problem is I can't really get another mark for that because I've already got my submax for sort of analysing epoch. Maybe I'd have 2 submaxes in here. So even though that removal of lactic acid is correct, maybe I've already got the 3 that's available for analysing epoch. So what do I have to do now? I have to show about ways that epoch can be minimised. Well, what have I put? Finally, to minimise epoch, comma, finally, comma, to minimise epoch, comma, the athlete must warm up. Okay, because this reduces oxygen deficit. They must complete an active cool down. And now I'm into my maxes. Because this maintains venous return and stroke volume. This means the muscle remains flushed with oxygenated blood. So in other words, I've made sure that I've analysed epoch. I've broken it down and explained both parts. And I've made sure that I've made reference to a range of ways of minimising epoch. In other words, I've taken my knowledge of epoch and used it in the structural reference of the question that's been posed to me. I need to take a breath. I need to sip something. I'll be back to you imminently.
Okay, we're back, right?
Yes,
yeah,
we
we're
are.
Good.
Yes.
Okay. Whew. Yeah, that was a bit of a monster session. So, anyway, so there we are. Any questions you'd like me to answer?
Yes, we've got a couple of questions from Bethany.
Okay.
Bethany's asking, how long does epoch last?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, we kind of covered that a moment ago, but a couple of just reminders. So the key things to do there to separate it into the 2 chunks. So the fast component of epoch we would describe as 30-second period for 50% resynthesis of PC, and 2 to 3 minutes. Just check your exam board exact numbers on that one for 100% resynthesis of PC. So that would be the fast component. Slow component, the typical number we use is 5 minutes, 5 minutes worth. But we also want to understand that depending on the extent of our work, if we work really, really intensely, we sometimes say it can last up to an hour. So 5 minutes plus would be a good way of thinking about that. You certainly should get the mark for saying 5 minutes plus.
Okay, thank you. And the other question also from Bethany, she's saying, I'm doing the OCR exam, and in the spec, it says that in the slow lactic component of recovery,
temperature and ventilation, yeah,
as well as removing lactic acid, it also maintains body temperature and maintains ventilation and circulation.
Yeah.
Could you explain how and why it does this?
Okay, so the key thing to realise, it actually, all that stuff I was banging on about earlier with regard to the epoch being bigger than the O2 deficit, the point is there, and you're right, OCR do cover this, so the point is there that for epoch to be powered, we have to maintain our temperature up at an elevated level for that to operate. So the temperature is maintained a little higher than resting levels. Equally, circulation, and particularly they're referring there to the distribution of blood to the worked muscle, remains they remain vasodilated. That those arterioles and precapillary sphincters leading to that work muscle, so we can be flushing that lactic acid out. So that's circulation. And ventilation remains elevated post-exercise for the same reason. So that's why that happens. So the circulation, the ventilation is so that we ultimately transport oxygenated blood through the worked muscle to remove that lactic acid. And I've forgotten the other bit. The temperature is also the case. So we maintain an elevated temperature for the same reason. So if you like, those are really efficient. Now, if you want to think about it in real technicolor, you might remember Bethany, wasn't it? You might remember, Bethany, that temperature also has a dominant impact when we look at something like oxygen dissociation. We know from, was it session 4 or session 3? I forget now. But we know that if temperature is higher, we move the oxygen dissociation curve to the right and we dissociate more oxygen and therefore remove lactate more efficiently. So that increase of that elevated temperature also helps with that metabolic process. So hopefully that's helpful. There's kind of a little session all on its own just there, really.
Yep.
Yeah. Any of this?
Yeah. And can you tell me? That's not from Bethany. That's from me. Can you tell me about neogenesis? What is it?
It's a tribute rock band from the 80s and 90s. Neogenesis. It also sounds like a really disturbing political movement. The neogenicists. That could be very. You don't want to get into that. Yeah. You don't want to upset those guys. That's not going to end well. So yeah, okay. So again, I sort of flirted with this, because this is, in some of the specifications, this is in much more detail in others. Okay, so I kind of just skated over it because I didn't want to mislead too many people. But so the key thing I would say there is I would encourage you to research something called the Cori cycle. Okay, the Cori cycle, and basically the Cori cycle, CORI. I'm remembering that rightly, CORI, it describes how we have a cyclical relationship between lactate and glucose. So we know already that if we break down glucose into pyruvate and then it converts to lactate, we know we get a net gain of 2 ATP. But if we can reconvert lactate back to pyruvate and up to glucose, we get a net gain of 6 ATP, and then the glucose can be used again either anaerobically or aerobically through the glycolysis process. So think of it as reverse glycolysis, and the liver plays a very, very important role in that. So it's called the Cori cycle. It's an extraction of additional ATP from the energy-rich product of lactate. Now, again, I'm just going to stop myself from taking that further because I just want to give you just enough on that. If you want to go in more detail, go and have a look at the Cori cycle online. There's a lot of information. We've got tutorials on it as well on the EverLearner. Go and take a look. Any other points?
Yes, there is one last comment. Someone is saying the removal of lactic acid is not on the AQA specification, and I have never learned it at school. Does that mean I don't need to know it for my exam?
I have to check. My belief is that if you if you're asking me, is the exact wording removal of lactic acid on the AQA spec, I'll check that and I'll confirm. But what is definitely on the AQA spec is the removal of lactic acid in the slow component of EPOC. Now, if it's in there, you should have a knowledge of where that goes. So the bit I just said there to wasn't to Bethany, was it? Oh, it was to Bethany.
Yeah.
You probably don't need to go that far, but you'd certainly need to know about the removal of lactic acid. And my argument would be that if it's being removed, you should have an understanding of where it's being removed to. So that would be my view on that. Now, I'd also say to people, obviously in this pre-exam state, we all get a bit obsessed with exactly what's on the spec, and that's normal. But also, don't be afraid to learn something in a little bit more detail. Maybe, especially at the start of courses, things like that, of course. But a specification, as we learned from David Didow recently, is a sample of what's important to learn. Now, I completely take the point that in this pre-exam kind of frenzy, just tell me what I need to know. I get it. I do understand that, and I think we do a good job to provide that. But don't underestimate the need to have a broader picture. The other day when I did, I know you're going to say something. The other day when I did the oxygen dissociation stuff, I think was it session 3 or 4? I'm muddled up with my order now. I covered something called the principle of cooperativity. Let me be clear about this. It is not on any of the exam boards. None. But the bit that is on it, which is the Bohr shift, you literally cannot learn it properly unless you understand that basic principle. You remember it was like CO2 didn't want to detach from hemoglobin and oxygen didn't want to attach until its mates kind of did. You can't understand the Bohr shift, you can't understand the oxygen dissociation curve without having that basic principle. And I think it's the same here. Why would someone learn lactic acid's removed and you don't know what happens to it or what it is? It doesn't make sense to me. So, look, I mean, shoot me if you want, but that would be my kind of philosophical and practical approach to it. But you guys in AQA, you definitely need to know that lactic acid is removed. I will triple check on the exact wording, and I can write to you a really concise answer if you want. But yeah, I remain proud of having told you. Sorry, Marty, you wanted to say something about that?
I was just going to basically make this point that I think often we need to understand specifications as different points within a field of knowledge, but often those points can't be understood fully without understanding the things in between. Yeah. So even things that are not by its name in the specification, you still should know about them. And then everything else will become clear. I
think the issue with that, of course, is what I said before. We're in this frenzied pre-exam state, exactly. And you students know because you're probably dreaming about A-level exams right now. Maybe they're nightmares. Who knows? But so I completely get it. I understand, but I first and foremost see myself as an educator, not as an exam prep. Now we're doing exam prep right now, and I think you guys can all see that. But I also want to ignite you. The other day I was talking about mitochondria and I almost got into like an alien conspiracy. The other day I taught you about the principle of cooperativity because I think it's essential to your fundamental knowledge of our subject. So these are minor points, and I will continue to do that for the rest of my career. Okay, any other questions?
Okay. No more questions. I think it's probably time to start wrapping it up. Celebrating that we've dropped 29
That is
frames.
Ridiculous. That is amazing. Yeah, I'm really happy about that. I'm going to post that on social media later. I'm really happy. Literally nobody cares, but I'm really happy about it. Yeah, and the other thing I was going to say about this, we're really enjoying Thursdays at the moment because as much as we love doing this live show and stream, I'm sure you, I hope you can see that, but it's really hard work. So Marta and I we've done 6 live shows this week in 4 days. And we've been doing other broadcasting and recording and all kinds of video work as well. So for us, Fridays represent a bit of a kind of just having a bit of rest and recuperation, a bit of preparation for the next week. So we'll be doing that. So we enjoy our Fridays because we have a bit of downtime. But it's also a period where we're going to start to interpret some of the responses that you've sent in to us, and we're going to be starting to publish those and send those out. Can I remind you, please? Subscribe just there. Is it that side or is it that side? I always forget which way. Subscribe, please. It's super important. It's a nothing thing for you. It's a massive thing for us. Please, we appreciate it. All the best from us. Have a good Thursday evening. I've got podcasting and football to play. All the best.
The traditional classroom environment doesn't suit everyone. Students that don't fit this pace of learning begin to lose confidence. The problem is, the current learning model has holes in it. Luckily, the EverLearner.com is here to fill those holes. With the EverLearner Classroom, each student is given a chance to master each subject at their own pace. With thousands of video tutorials and tens of thousands of automated questions on the site, students can progress at their own individual pace. And because every interaction is tracked within the site, teachers can review students' progress and gain access to razor-sharp data. Teachers will have more time to engage with small groups and be better informed of where their time and support is needed. With the EverLearner, teachers can leave the traditional model behind and become facilitators, coaches, and inspirers. There's a reason we have over 100,000 registered students. To learn more, visit our website today.